Welcome back to Data Driven Recruiting. I'm Sophia Beck, and I'm joined by my co-host Tigran Sloyan.
Hey, Sophia. So today we're talking about test validation and adverse impact.
Right.
And I guess we talked a lot about how, introducing assessments, especially at the top of your funnel, is a key component of making your just overall selection process more fair. But one important question that comes up around that is, how do you avoid adverse impact, and how can you actually prove that you do not have any sort of an adverse impact in your test? Because even though you introduce a test to specifically make the process more fair, you still have to be able to defend whenever like a case is brought up that you do not have adverse impact. And this is actually a very strict legal requirement, especially for like larger companies, large public
compliance
companies.
with the equal employer opportunities. And I think it's a really important topic because you're putting this assessment at the top of the funnel to make this more fair and then leveling the playing ground. So we also want to make sure it passes all the legal, guidelines and compliance things to ensure that you're indeed doing it and be able to prove it.
Exactly.
So, is there like a certain set of rules?
There actually is. So the Equal Opportunity Employment Committee and 3 other government committees have adopted like a set of uniform guidelines that say how you should be able to prove that your test does not have adverse impact in it. And there's 2 components to it. So one of the components is reliability.
Okay.
So test reliability, like the main factor that contributes to test reliability is the concept of retesting. So if you were to have the same group of people, take that same test again, some other time or maybe like right after they took it, would the results be reliable? Like, would you actually just get too much variance in their results, or would you basically have the same selection criteria? And this is especially important if you change your test, right? So like I've seen a lot where companies have their own engineers design a certain test, or their own employees or managers, hiring managers design their own tests. And then a few months later, they're like, oh my God, all the questions are leaked. Let's just change it. If the new test is not actually going to produce the same results, so if you took that same test and gave it to the people that took the test, the previous test a few months ago, if you can't prove that retest would produce a highly consistent output, then you basically cannot protect this test and you cannot prove.
I see. So the test, let's say it's a test for, I guess, our new grad engineers, let's say, and the test, when we say test, it doesn't mean the specific question. It's like the test that we're giving to this particular
as
step.
part of the selection process, right?
Then when you change the questions, you need to ensure that the ones that you were using and the ones you're using later, they are producing consistent results.
You need to be able to prove it. If you can't prove it, then that's like one aspect where, if you're ever in a courtroom trying to prove that your assessments do not have adverse impact, that's one of the things that you need to be able to do. If you can't do it, you're in a tough spot.
And when you say adverse impact, can you elaborate like a little more? Like adverse impact on
the so-called protected group, what the uniform guidelines define as a protected group is race, sex, or any sort of ethnic group. So those are the 3 categories that are defined as protected groups. You need to be able to prove that you don't have any part of your selection process, not just tests, but specifically tests do not have an adverse impact.
So meaning that this test is working negatively towards those protective groups. That's like what adverse impact?
Well, they have a specific definition of how to measure it. It's called the 4/5 rule. I'm assuming people can look up what the 4/5 or the 80% rule is, but they have a specific definition of, if I look at your selection process, do you have some sort of an adverse impact there or not? But reliability is actually not the only measure. There is also just overall validity, and validity is far more complex to measure. And the uniform guidelines actually have like 3 different ways of of measuring it. The main one is actually called content-related validation. There is three, but like the one that's used a lot is content-related validation. And what content-related validation is that you start with the so-called job analysis. And the job analysis is a pretty involved process that means just understanding what are the key requirements for this job, right? So if I was to, usually starts with like you bring in a representative group of like hiring managers, you discuss with them sort of, you have them write down what are the main requirements, you kind of find a common denominator between all of them.
Right.
And then after that, you come up with a short list of like skills, knowledge, requirements that are critical for this role.
Yeah.
And then after you've completed the job analysis, then you have to show that the questions in your assessments are actually measuring those and only those skills and requirements, and are not sort of assessing things that are either not important or not even related for that specific job at all.
Yeah. And then do you do empirical studies to figure out whether the questions you're asking and the skills you're measuring for the specific job is actually valid and correlated?
Well, that's actually the other piece. I think it's called criterion-related validation, and that one is way more difficult because you actually have to show that people who do well on the test actually do well on the job. So that one requires a more sort of longer-term analysis to say if we, the people who scored well on this assessments, how did they perform on the job? Unlike the other type of analysis where you kind of can do it in your own timeline, the other one takes much, much, much longer.
So how do you prove the content-related validation that it's valid? What are some of the evidence that we can present if we have to prove it to someone?
Yeah, it's usually the experts, right? So you basically call them the job experts, people who specialize in that job, to actually be able to look at, here's the job, here's the skill sets that's important for it, and here are the questions, here's what exactly those questions measure. And then an expert is supposed to be able to validate to say, yes, what this question is measuring and what this job is about are consistent with each other. So again, there's no data-driven proof in this type of validation, but it relies on experts to validate that.
Yeah.
So if you're ever in court, they might call a secondary expert in that field to say, do you agree that these questions and this job are a match for each other, or are they not?
Got it. All right, so let's wrap it up. What is the bottom line for today?
The bottom line is, making sure, being able to prove that an assessment does not introduce adverse impact is not as simple as it might sound. I think people naturally assume that, assessments are meant to, introduce fairness, not the other way around. So, but there are very, very strict legal requirements, and the only real way to be prepared for it is to have what we tend to call a framework for assessment, something where you can clearly write down what is my assessment, what is it measuring, what is it not measuring, and have research into it, because otherwise you're just shooting in the dark and you're never going to be able to have a defensible case for it.
Got it. Thanks for the insights, and thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.